Since our founding, the United States has been devoted to universal principles of freedom, our faith in the spirit of liberty, and our commitment to help others secure freedom's blessings, fosters peace and prosperity at home and in the world.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
While tyrants attack the values that allow human freedom to flourish, we must remain a beacon of hope for all who desire to express themselves without fear, to assemble as a people, to worship as they believe, to engage in free enterprise, and to elect their leaders.
I, George Herbert Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
A strong democracy is vital to protect the spirit of liberty at home. In living up to the ideals of our founders, Americans have been given hills to climb and found the strength to climb them. By reaffirming what unites us rather than divides us, we can meet any challenge.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
We must make good on democracy's promise of a just society and a better life for all Americans. Too many still feel left behind. America is always at its best when the spirit of liberty flourishes.
The stakes for America are never small. If our country does not lead the cause of freedom, it will not be led. We must live up to the calling we share. Civility is not a tactic or a sentiment. It is the determined choice of trust over cynicism, of community over chaos. And this commitment, if we keep it, is a way to shared accomplishment.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the President and CEO of the George W. Bush Presidential Center, Ken Hirsch.
Good morning and welcome to the George W. Bush Presidential Center on the road. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our generous sponsors who see the value in our work: PepsiCo, HBO, Mr. and Mrs. Robert Steele, Beth and Leonard Wolf, and the Continental Grain Company, as well as many others who have supported our work throughout the years. This event is on the record. You're welcome and encouraged to share your thoughts on social media, hashtag Spirit of Liberty, all one word. Thank you for being here today. The Bush Center, housed in Dallas, is a unique institution in this country. It's a center of a former president that has resources and the calling to go where other people won't go and to access other resources that many can't. We're comprised of two major initiatives. One is the museum and library, which houses the president's archives, records, and the documents from his 8 consequential years in office that allows the public to understand what it means to be a leader in that chair. And also the Bush Institute, which is a nonpartisan policy think tank, and as President Bush likes to say, a do tank, designed to further the ideals of freedom and opportunity. It's an honor for me to lead a team that is charged with the mandate to continue the great work started by President and Mrs. Bush while they were in the White House and to take on new work inspired by them. And we do that in a values-based manner, anchored on the principles that led President Bush of economic and political freedom, less government dependency and increased opportunity, and a strong and compassionate country at home and abroad. And around these values, we execute our mission of developing leaders, advancing policy, and taking action to solve today's most pressing challenges. And our mission is absolutely critical more than ever today. We execute that through our 3 what we call impact centers: domestic excellence, global leadership, and our engagement agenda. To be a great country around domestic excellence, you should have strong economic growth, great education, take care of your veterans, and develop future leaders. And those are our 4 initiative areas domestically. And internationally, for global leadership, we spread the benefits of global health, human freedom and democracy, and empowering women. Today, we launch some of our most important work, that of reaffirming the principles of freedom and democracy here at home, and our example and how important it is to the world. This is a loud voice that only a presidential center can assert. It's a shame that we have to reassert the values of democracy and liberty here at home and how it intersects freedom and national security. But we do, and we will. These are principles that are foundational for our country. We enjoy the rights to pursue personal, individual goals, to right and to dissent, because we have a strong democracy, not despite it, even if that dissension makes us feel uncomfortable. Just like a muscle that needs to be stretched in order to be strengthened, a democracy works best when it comes through a good workout. In fact, discomfort is the healthy byproduct of a thriving democracy. And we at the Bush Center are honored to serve the example of principled leadership practiced by our 43rd president. For without principled leadership, our elected officials are little more than a mood ring on the hand of the American people. You'll hear today from three people who have been touched by the programs at the Bush Center: Grace Jo, Tim Ware, Ramon Padilla. We celebrate these three leaders who exemplify the hundreds of men and women who are our partners in the promotion and celebration of freedom. You'll also hear from an incredible set of servant leaders with whom we are partnering to reinforce the themes. And pulling it all together, I want to thank our Executive Director, Holly Kuzmich, and Director of Global Initiatives, Amanda Schnetzer, who work tirelessly, as well as our operations team that is here today to make sure events like this have the impact that they deserve. I encourage you to learn more about our work at bushcenter.org, and you'll hear at the end a call to action and an important paper that we are issuing today about these principles and how we can start to make a change. It is now my honor and privilege to introduce a shining example of principled leadership executed with unmatched grace. Please join me in welcoming the former First Lady of the United States, Mrs. Laura W. Bush.
Thank you all. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Ken. And good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's The Spirit of Liberty. In 1944, a federal judge and judicial philosopher, Judge Learned Hand, delivered a speech in Central Park to over 1 million people on I Am an American Day. His remarks spoke directly to the 150,000 people in the audience who had just been sworn in as naturalized United States citizens. He said, "We've gathered here to affirm a faith in a common purpose, a common conviction, a common devotion. Some of us have chosen America as the land of our adoption. The rest of us have come from those who did the same. What was the object that nerved us, or those who went before us, to this choice? We sought liberty, freedom from oppression, freedom from want, freedom to be ourselves." Behind me, just across Columbus Circle, is Central Park. 73 years later, we're here to affirm that common faith that Learned Hand proclaimed. Today, we'll begin a conversation about how to strengthen our democracy at home and help foster a new consensus that spreads freedom abroad. Over the past century, the world has witnessed the transformative power of freedom around the world. In 1900, there were no true democracies. My mother was born before women had the right to vote, and only until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were restrictions on voting by African Americans finally lifted. Conditions began to change in what has been described as waves of transformation. By the end of the 20th century, from Western Europe to Latin America to Asia and Africa, societies that had been ruled by military governments or dictators were choosing democracy, and communism collapsed almost completely. Millions of people around the world no longer think of themselves as subjects, but rather as citizens with rights, and that's a major accomplishment. This progress is a testament to the human spirit, to the sacrifices made by brave men and women who fight for freedom, and to those courageous individuals who continue this fight for freedom today. George and I believe that freedom is the universal desire of all people. During our time in the White House and now at the Bush Institute, we've met with dozens of dissidents and democracy advocates from every part of the world. Despite their differences of history, culture, language, or religion, one thing is constant: a fundamental belief in the dignity of all human beings and their right to be free. These conversations have reminded me of the fragility of freedom, particularly in places where it's newly won. Last year, Freedom House noted the 11th year of decline of freedom around the world. This is due to the use of more forceful tactics by authoritarian regimes and to a rise in global terrorism. We've seen populist and nationalist forces gain strength in democratic states. Even in the United States, which remains a beacon of freedom to others, Freedom House has raised concerns about signs of erosion that need attention. Research shows that less than 1/3 of American students in grades 4, 8, and 12 are proficient in civics. The knowledge of the American constitutional system and the role of government and civil society in the lives of free people. This trend is even more concerning when you consider more than 1/3 of respondents in a recent Annenberg study could not name a single right protected by the First Amendment. More than 30% of people surveyed couldn't name a single branch of government. We must prepare our children and grandchildren with the tools they need to be informed, engaged citizens who care about individual liberty and democracy. We must teach them history. We must insist they understand the government they're blessed to live under. We must teach our children how to listen, to show empathy, to show civility in the face of disagreement, and to overcome malice and hate. And we must model that behavior ourselves. This is the task of parents, teachers, and anyone who touches the lives of young people today. And it's our patriotic duty as Americans. This situation didn't develop overnight. We've been neglecting to tell our nation's story for years. It will take time and effort to repair. 2 years ago, the Bush Institute released Freedom Matters, a supplemental curriculum for high schoolers. Our goal with Freedom Matters is simple: to foster the next generation of Americans, perhaps even a future president of the United States, to care about democracy and individual liberty at home and abroad. Freedom Matters is available online for anyone to download free of charge. The 16 lessons in Freedom Matters combine the personal stories of dissidents and democracy advocates featured in the Bush Institute's Freedom Collection with broader universal concepts of freedom, rule of law, limited representative government, and the protection of basic human rights. This is just one of the ways the Bush Institute is committed to developing a consensus about the value of freedom. We're grateful to work with partners on a new initiative. I'm thrilled to announce that in collaboration with Freedom House and the Penn Biden Center for Diplomacy and Global Engagement, we're launching a major public opinion research study, a poll that will help us learn how Americans feel about their democracy and what Americans believe their role is in spreading liberty abroad. The results of the poll will serve as a resource for others who share our commitment to democracy and freedom. Grace Jo is a fine example of someone who's committed to spreading liberty worldwide. Grace came to the United States as a refugee from North Korea, and she knows what life is like when freedom is absent. As an inaugural recipient of the Bush Institute's North Korea Freedom Scholarship, Grace wants to help other North Koreans trapped beyond Pyongyang's Iron Curtain. George and I are honored that she's here today to share her story. Please join me in welcoming Grace Jo.
My name is Grace Jo, and I am an American. Thank you. It is my privilege to be an American. When freedom is absent in my life, it was dark, sad, desperate, and I was fearful. My grandmother, when she raised me until I was 7 years old, and she passed away because she starved and she didn't have any food to eat. Her last words was to ask us to leave the village and survive. Also, her last wish was to eat a baked potato. I was so little, I was not able to provide what she wished for. But grace of God, I survived, I came to America, and I found freedom. My father, who was a hero to me, he tried his best to find a way to help us to live in North Korea. However, the regime ruthlessly killed my father. Only his crime was to cross the border between China and North Korea. And his only crime was to bring a bag of rice for his dying children. He was handcuffed on a train. He was not able to sit or stand completely. He starved for many days and severely tortured. My youngest brother, Gukbom, he died because of starvation. We didn't have enough corn skin powder to make his porridge. He decided to leave us first, maybe because he realized that the regime, the country, is not worth for him to leave. When I grew up in China, I was able to eat white rice and pork, and sometimes I can eat meat. The life in China was difficult, but it was way better than life in North Korea. However, I had to hide and run to place every time in China. However, we try very hard, and how much we careful we are in China, we still got caught many times by Chinese police and forcefully sent back to North Korea. Each time we sent back to North Korea, I had unforgettable memories that keep reminds me that freedom is a treasure. I now know the blessings of liberty in the United States. I am a happy college student, which is almost the dream life. I always dreamed to go to university and study all I wanted. Now I became a college student, and I'm very honored and very happy to share this news. I also work at a private dental office and support my family. Also, I travel place to place to raise my voice for my people. All this life, I cannot imagine if I lived in North Korea or in China. So I feel very blessed again, and I'm very happy to be an American. Thank you. American leadership to advance the freedom in the world is essential because keeping people alive in the world is the most important and valuable thing in this world, I believe. Because when people try to help other people, it's very difficult, and they also face challenges and difficulties. When I meet them, I always tell them this. Keeping a person alive is 10 times harder than you killing a person. So you are doing a good job, and keep going. Working together, Americans have the ability to change the world. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Nikki Haley, Madeleine Albright, and Condoleezza Rice.
Well, good morning. My name is Amanda Schnetzer, and I'm the Director of Global Initiatives at the Bush Institute in Dallas. New York was actually my home from 1999 to 2003. Some of those were difficult days, but I can tell you that the spirit of liberty never wavered here, and it's alive and kicking today. So thank you for hosting us in this city today. This session is about naming threats to liberty in the world today. Some are old, some are new. But this session is mostly about turning our attention as a nation to action and getting things done. And at the core, it's about affirming the imperative of American leadership. To help us explore these issues, we have three distinguished leaders who really need no introduction. But for the record, I'm joined on the stage by Nikki Haley, the U.S. Permanent Representative to the United Nations, Madeleine Albright, the 64th U.S. Secretary of State and Chair of the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs, and Condoleezza Rice, the 66th U.S. Secretary of State. It's going to be hard for me to say Madam Secretary on this stage today, so I'm going to try to mix it up a little bit and make sure we know with whom we're chatting. So, shall we begin? I think we'll start with the first piece that I mentioned and simply name the threats that we have in the world today. And they're serious. Nuclear weapons in North Korea, the brutality of ISIS, Russia's aggression in Europe, China's aggression in Asia, and more. All of these threats attack the values and institutions that have energized America's growth as a nation and have contributed to spreading the spirit of liberty abroad. Ambassador Haley, let's begin with you. How is the United States prioritizing these traditional threats in the world and to our nation? And what should American leadership look like, whether at the UN or through our alliances, in order to address them?
Well, thank you. And first, I want to thank President and Mrs. Bush for having us here today. Putting me in between these two cool women is probably like the biggest highlight. So thank you very much. And Grace Jo, you inspire us so much. You are the reason we fight for what we fight for. So thank you very, very much. You know, we do have a lot of threats, but we also have to remember that leadership matters. So our biggest threats, obviously, North Korea, Iran, ISIS. Those are the three because we have to always make sure we're doing everything we can to protect Americans and our allies. So we'll continue on that front. But then you have so many other issues. When you look at the migration problems that we have, and you see the human rights abuses that are happening, whether it's in Burma, whether we're seeing what's happening in Venezuela, in Cuba, all of those things, they matter too, because if any government doesn't take care of their people, conflict will follow. Human rights is such a clear part of what we have to do. And then you have to look at China and Russia as major players. Russia can't necessarily win anything. They don't have a big enough military. They don't have a strong economy. So they insert themselves in every situation to create chaos. China is doing what they do best. They are business people. They are making sure they have infrastructure all over the world. So they're making sure they have a stance in there. And the United States needs to be above all of that. We need to make sure we're watching our threats. We need to make sure that we continue to lead in every aspect. And we always have to just be true to who we are as Americans.
Dr. Rice?
I would agree completely. You've listed the threats and the crises, and I think it's clear that the international system feels not just chaotic, but indeed dangerous. And I'm really glad you are where you are, Ambassador. You're doing a terrific job. And let me just again, I think that Grace Jo gave us the testimony that we need at the core of what we're talking about here. I do want to say, I think the threats are more complex, they're more difficult. I think that the nature of social media and the rapidity of communication makes it more difficult than when I was there or when Madeleine was there. But I think we need also to recognize that the United States has done this before. It could not have looked as if we were going to get to 1989, 1990, and 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed, Germany was unified. It couldn't have looked that way in 1946. When the Italian communists won 48% of the vote and the French communists won 46% of the vote, the question wasn't would Eastern Europe be communist, it was would Western Europe be communist. And in 48, the Berlin crisis and the birth of Israel, and war breaks out in the Middle East the next day, and the Soviet Union explodes a nuclear weapon 5 years ahead of schedule in 1949, and the Chinese communists win. it could not have looked as if we were going to triumph. And so you have to ask what happened. And American leadership happened. The United States of America said, we're not going to return home. We're not going to be terrified by these threats. We are going to insert ourselves right in the middle of these threats. And a pledge through Article 5 of NATO, an attack upon one is an attack upon all. Think of taking that pledge when the Soviet Union was astride half of Europe. We decided we were going to stand for people who needed to live in liberty and freedom. I had the great joy of being trained by Madeleine's father, Joseph Corbell. She'll tell her own story, but the Corbell family would not have survived without the United States of America. So yes, I think the threats are multiple. We can talk about specific tactical and strategic responses to them, but the core has to be, the United States has to be confident enough to say that with our leadership, we can solve the problems that we face. There is nobody else to do it. Anybody else who tries to do it will not do it on the basis of our values. And if we don't work from our values, our interests will be compromised as well.
Secretary Albright?
Well, I do think the threats are as listed, but I also agree with Condi in terms of the role that the United States has to play. I do think this is an incredibly complex time. To use a diplomatic term, the world is a mess. And the bottom line is that the issues are coming from everywhere, and I think Grace Jo's story is so really moving. And I just have to add something. One of the things, I'm an immigrant, and the thing that I liked most of all was to give people their naturalization certificates. Mrs. Bush, your story. And so the first time I did it was on July 4th, 2000 at Monticello. And I'm giving out naturalization certificates, and this man, I hear him say all of a sudden, can you believe it? I'm a refugee, and I just got my naturalization certificate from the Secretary of State. And I went up to him and I said, can you believe that a refugee is Secretary of State? And I really do think that speaks to what America is about. And so, welcome. I am an American, and so are you. So it's great. I do think that the issues are, and I think, Condi, you described them so well. In addition to that, I think we're living in a very different world where the combination of the technology, the interconnectedness of society have created issues where people, it used to be that there always was a division between rich and poor, but the poor didn't always know what the rich had. And so the rapidity of the technology is something that is out there. I do think it is absolutely essential for the United States to lead. And Ambassador Haley, Nikki, you said I could call you, is that I think being at the UN, you can really see that unless the UN speaks, the U.S. speaks at the UN, either at the beginning to start the conversation or at the end to summarize, or sometimes in the middle, nothing happens. And so I am very concerned in terms of how we project our leadership, how we explain to the American people that nothing works without us, and that there are certain sacrifices that have to be made to have that leadership role, but we don't do it alone. The word indispensable, there's nothing about it that says alone. It means engaged. And I think there are incredible challenges out there that you see every day that we used to. But I really do think American leadership in this is absolutely crucial, and how to explain it to the Americans.
Well, and I think I have an interesting story in terms of when I first got there, we obviously had issues, but the one that was really defining was when the president made the decision to hit Syria, and after the chemical weapons. When he made that decision, the number of calls and emails I received from countries saying, it's so good to see America lead again, was amazing. And it was enlightening to me because they felt like we had been dormant, and they really feel weaker when the U.S. doesn't lead. They want to see us speak out. They want us to weigh in. They want us to lead on the international stage. And when we do, they feel more confident. And so I think, you're seeing that whether it's with Japan and South Korea on the North Korea issue, you're seeing that whether it's with the, our Arab partners when we're dealing with Iran, all of those things, whether it's Venezuela or Cuba, I think it's always going to be important for us to know the power of our voice and also know what leadership means to the world.
Could I just pick up on it? Because you also, Nikki, were a governor. And you know America in ways that those of us who hung out in the foreign policy establishment will never know it. And so I think that you're absolutely right about how the world feels when America leads or does not lead. I think what I hope we'll see as the administration progresses, because it's early yet, is there needs to be an overarching narrative about what America is doing. I thought that the strike on Syria was essential. I think that the voice about what is going on in Venezuela and the sanctions on Venezuela, this is a middle-income country where people can't find medicine and food, and you're going to have a refugee crisis in countries that are now stable in the Andean region. And the president said, what Maduro is doing is unacceptable. He is acting anti-democratically. We need, though, a narrative that says human rights, democracy, what happens in other countries matters to us. And if we step back and say we'll leave others to their own devices, we don't have an overarching way of explaining why what we do in Syria or what we do in Venezuela is important. And as a governor, you know that getting that narrative then out to South Carolina or California or Texas ultimately has to happen, because without that, you can't sustain American engagement.
I think it's right. You have to have not only international communication, but the country needs to believe that everything's okay. They need to know their stability. They need to know that we're leading, and they need to know why. And so I think that's very important, that we have to always keep making sure we're in touch with Americans to let them know why we're doing what we're doing overseas.
Secretary Albright, I'm going to turn to you for a moment. We, as you mentioned, we live in a world of new challenges and some new dangers, and some of them we're only beginning to find the right strategies and tools to deal with them. Take, for example, the cyber threat on our financial system, and now we know on our election system. As chair of NDI, you have turned significant attention to this issue, and particularly problems of disinformation. How do we begin to grapple with new challenges like these?
Well, this is part of what makes this era so different. But let me just say, I have always been interested in the role of information and political change. There's always some addition, whether it's the printing press or... And I did my dissertation on the role of the Czechoslovak press in 1968. And then I wrote a book about the Polish press under the Wałęsa period. And they're really information, and at that stage, it was cassettes. What happened was Wałęsa would be in one factory and he'd tape it and they'd send it to another one. So there's always something. But what has happened now is the rapidity of the technological spread is just remarkable. And cyber, that we don't fully understand. And what it is that those who don't like us can affect with cyber. Condi was talking about NATO. When on the 60th anniversary of NATO, I was asked to lead a new strategic concept for the new Secretary General. And one of the things we talked about was whether a cyber threat was an Article 5 threat, because Estonia's banking system had been brought down. And at that stage, people were kind of nervous, saying we don't really know the genesis and what do we do. I think now we understand that a cyber threat can bring a state down. There's also the usage of cyber and technology to undermine systems. And one of the things, as chairman of NDI, I have just come from Georgia and Ukraine. And in Ukraine, I was briefed by people that showed what the Russians had been doing to undermine the system there through fake news. And they were able to penetrate in a number of ways and take a piece of a story and turn it around. So, for instance, Ukraine is a very complex country, and the western part during World War II, there were some that worked with the Germans because of what the Soviets had done to them. So all of a sudden, there were stories in the Ukrainian paper about the fact that all of western Ukraine were Nazis. And so they took pieces of information and pushed it. And I think we have to recognize that we are dealing with a president of a country, of Russia, who is a KGB agent. And they know how to do propaganda. And what they're doing is using information in a way to undermine the system, democracy. What they want to do is undermine the democracies in Europe and separate us from Europe. And I do believe that they have figured out how to make our life more complicated in every single way through various new methods, tweets and bots and various aspects. And we we are an open society, and they are using our openness. And how do we deal with it without closing down? So it is a challenge for all of us to think through, but it has changed because we are being attacked in a new way through a new system. And it's very interesting because the Russian chairman of their Joint Chiefs, of their General Staff, Gerasimov, has in fact developed a doctrine about this. It's hybrid warfare, and here their military guy has kind of put it together in the way that they plan to reassert themselves in a variety of places in the world.
Dr. Issa, I'd like to ask you, as Secretary Albright just said, disinformation isn't new, and the mindset behind this disinformation, meaning Putin's worldview, is not new either. Is this simply a case of everything old is new again? Do we need to revive Sovietology? I'm a former, one of the last Sovietology students, or what's different?
Well, we thought we were
We
done
all are.
in Sovietology, but maybe not. I do think that this is an old story, but with very new capacity. And we have to recognize that not only does the cyber world allow you to more rapidly influence, but it allows you to do it in a way that is masked in ways that it was not masked before. I've done some work to look back when I was a student at what some of the Soviet efforts to influence fifth columns and so forth, and actually they were kind of clumsy. And this isn't clumsy. This is highly sophisticated. I will say that I hope we are on top of what really happened to us, that we're really investigating it in ways that bring all of our tools, including what people at places like Google and Google and Facebook will know about how this is done. And then we've got to fix it. Because my own view is, if they do this to us once, it's their fault. If they do this to us twice, it's ours. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so a national effort to figure out what happened here and then to stop it the next time is going to be very important. Madeleine said the right thing. We have to do it without shutting ourselves down, absolutely. But we need better cooperation between the private sector and the government on this. Sometimes out where I live in the Silicon Valley, people talk about privacy. We all want to protect privacy, but we also want to protect the country. And that conversation is not going on in a very effective way. There's too much suspicion between government and the private sector. And I'll say one other thing. I know the Europeans worry a lot about privacy and some of the things that they believe American intelligence agencies may have done in their countries. But whatever differences we have with the Europeans about privacy pale in comparison to the differences that we have with Russia or China. And so I hope that the Europeans will be a part of this conversation as well.
And I find it fascinating because the Russians, God bless them, they're saying, why are Americans anti-Russian and why have we done the sanctions? Well, don't interfere in our elections and we won't be anti-Russian. And I think we have to be so hard on this and we have to hold them accountable and we have to get the private sector to understand they are responsible for this too. We all have to step up from this event. We can't just assume that that's going to happen again. And I will tell you that when a country can come interfere in another country's elections, that is warfare. It really is, because you're making sure that the democracy shifts from what the people want to giving out that misinformation. And we didn't just see it here. You can look at France and you can look at other countries. They are doing this everywhere. This is their new weapon of choice. And we have to make sure we get in front of it. And I can tell you our intelligence agencies are working overtime now because there's just so much when it comes to cyber threats that we have that we're having to deal with.
I will just say from the Silicon Valley perspective, I think that these companies are recognizing now this responsibility. And this is the time then for a kind of quiet national conversation. I won't say national conversation because I don't want to see it on the front pages of the New York Times, but I hope that people are reaching across these boundaries. I think there's a willingness to have that conversation that was not there even a few months ago, because this Russian effort has really gotten people's attention in the way that nothing else did.
But I think also we have to be very protective of our press. The U.S., our democracy depends on having a free press, people that are able to go out and cover stories as they want to, and really not undermine the importance of the press in this country, because we are an example. And by the way, one of the things just generally in terms of, Mrs. Bush, you were talking about Freedom House and what's been happening in other places. I think that what's happened with NDI, when we're out abroad talking to people about the importance of compromise and the parliaments working with their executive branch and how they can work better, and they look at me and they say, "You mean like you guys at this point?" So we need to remember that we're an example with our press, with our institutional structures. I think that's very important.
So let's turn to part two, and that is coming back to the question about the imperative of American leadership. Actually, it is no question. So I recently saw an email exchange where someone quipped that in Washington, D.C., there are no less than 8 dozen conversations going on right now about the future of the liberal democratic order. So we're going to start another one here today. Secretary Albright, what do you think about this sense, now years in the making, that the liberal democratic order formed in the wake of World War II is at risk? Is that order still relevant? What's the role of American leadership today?
I think the order is definitely still relevant, because I believe that we're all the same and people want to be living in societies where they can make their decisions and be respected for them. And I never like the fact that people say people in X country are not ready for democracy. Everybody is. It evolves in different ways. And I think, I have to say, I always sound so kind of sentimental, but I'm so proud to be an American because of the things that we've done, and especially if you've come to this country because of wanting to live in freedom. And I think that the question, however, is how do we explain what we're doing and how important it is to talk about the resiliency of democracy, and that the strength of democracy is that we can correct our mistakes. But it does require us to have honest conversations and to say, okay, for whatever reason, one election turns out one way. Why did it happen? What was the interference by the Russians? What was it that we missed about how the liberal order needs to operate? And, in fact, that it is based on respect for other people's views. And so I think it's more important than ever for the United States to act in a leadership role on this. And I really would like to thank President and Mrs. Bush for doing this, because I think it's a very important message. And I'm very proud to be a part of your system here. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Haley, you've been at the United Nations for 9 months now. The UN was formed in response to World War II, and its charter affirms human freedom and rule of law and aspires to progress and prosperity. Does the liberal democratic order have traction at the UN today, and how do you assert that?
What I tried to do at the United Nations was just give a strong voice to America. And I think the biggest surprise that I saw were the ambassadors there at the UN. They're not just figures that were sent. They each are the most trusted person that their president knew they could send, and they have their direct ear. So negotiations can actually happen at the UN. I can go and try and negotiate something, and they literally can get on the phone with their president, and we can start moving foreign policy. And so what I have found is the United Nations is the center of the universe for every other country. And so what my job is to show the American people why it matters to us, what the role of the United Nations can be, how we can make it more effective. And I think what we found is we're showing strength at the United Nations through the power of our voice, but also through the negotiations and then communicating what we want to see happen. The U.S. has led and will always lead. But if you look at the rest of the world, as much as we worry about the threats and the chaos that seems to be there, it's still in a better place than it was years ago. So it's improving slowly over time. It's just different issues and different threats that come up. And so I think it's important for us to use every avenue, whether it's NATO, whether it's the United Nations, whether it's any of those, and always make sure that we are not doing things alone. We're doing them together with other countries, but we're showing the power of our voice in the process.
I have to say, you just said something, Nikki, which is there are people who think that the ambassadors at the UN just go up and go to receptions and do nothing. And the bottom line is, it is the opposite. And I found when I got there that the people were either, they were high-level people in their own governments, and they acted from that perspective, and everybody works really hard, and you see more foreigners than any other diplomat, and being able to do that is so important in America's voice. But there are receptions, but they are working receptions.
They're those fun receptions, right? So,
Madeleine, those of us in Washington never thought that about.
No, I know that.
The liberal order, I think, is actually a bit in trouble. And I think the principles are still extremely important. And so what was it? It was, we believed in an international economy that was not zero-sum game. So the protectionism of the period between the First World War and the Second World War had led to a Great Depression, beggar thy neighbor trading policies. And so the people who found themselves in leadership after World War II said, not again. And they believed that with a free trading system, we could build prosperity for everybody, not a zero-sum game. Then there wouldn't be conflict and competition over resources and markets. We would compete, but it wouldn't be conflictual. Secondly, they believed in free peoples. We forget that when Germany and Japan were rebuilt, people feared that Germany and Japan would again rise and threaten their neighborhoods. So what did we say? No, if they're rebuilt as democracies, democracies don't fight one another. And there is something called the democratic peace that political scientists have demonstrated. Democracies don't fight one another, particularly mature democracies. And third, they counted on American military power to protect the whole thing. Now, you know, there are challenges to that. There are questions about whether the benefits of free trade have been evenly spread in our economy. That's a good question. But we have to recognize that the system really did create an awful lot of prosperity. And so without throwing the baby out with the bathwater, we've got to find a way to reaffirm that. But I think what the international order needed most was patience. And that's what I most see lacking. It took a long time to defeat the Soviet Union. But we did it on the basis of our own model prosperity draw and on the basis of our values, and we stayed the course. Through multiple administrations of different parties, we stayed the course. I always use the following example. People say, well, you can't do anything about the Russian annexation of Crimea, right? Maybe not in the short term. But for more than 40 years, we refused to accept the forcible incorporation of the Baltic states into the Soviet Union. As a matter of fact, I was the specialist of Soviet affairs for President George H.W. Bush on the NSC. And I had a stamp on my desk. And whenever you mentioned Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, you stamped it with, the United States does not recognize the forcible incorporation of the Baltic states into the Soviet Union. We stood for what was right, even if we couldn't do anything about it immediately. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, we've never had better friends than Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And so it takes patience. It takes recognizing that democracy takes time. Who are we as Americans to say, well, they just can't get it right? As I stood in front of that portrait of Ben Franklin as President Bush swore me in, I had to remember that the first American Constitution counted my ancestors as 3/5 of a man. And yet there I was, taking an oath of an office to that Constitution in front of old Ben Franklin, sworn in by a Jewish woman Supreme Court Justice, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, because the values and the institutions eventually got that piece of it more right than not. And so this democratic effort is a long-term effort, and sometimes I think one of your hardest problems is explaining to the American people and maybe even to the administration, this can be hard inside, as Madeleine and I will tell you, that these things take time.
These things take time. They also have taken, over the course of 70-plus years, bipartisanship. There was a sense during the Cold War of bipartisanship in our U.S. foreign policy. Certainly there were points of disagreement, and sometimes big ones, but there was a certain unity of vision and continuity. Was that real? Sometimes people say that wasn't real. Was that real, and can it live on today, and how? I'll turn that to
Well,
Albright
I
first.
really do believe it was real, and it needs to be. You can imagine that I worked very closely with Chairman Jesse Helms. And it was very important that we did that. It was through that we were able to have a bipartisan foreign policy, do expansion of NATO, any number of different things. I now am counting on bipartisanship in terms of funding democracy programs. Lindsey Graham is my best friend, and I think that it has been very important to make sure that the budget of the State Department and the various programs are funded bipartisanly because it is about American leadership. And so I think that it is important, and I've just done a lot of work with Steve Hadley, and I believe in bipartisanship. So, and it is essential. It is what America's about, which is why when we go abroad and we deal with opposition parties, to tell them that there are various issues that they have to work on together.
And I think it's bipartisan now. I think if you look at the way both parties strongly support what we're doing with North Korea and how we move forward in protecting it, the way that they look at our military and making sure that we're defending our military, building up our military, all of those things, what we've done with Venezuela. I mean, there's a lot of the focus on ISIS in Syria and Iraq and how we've been able to defeat them and how we're moving forward on all of those things. There is a lot of bipartisan support. And I can tell you in reference to the funding, what we've tried to do is really talk about what works and what doesn't work. You know, what can we improve on, what's absolutely necessary, and we can build off of that, and then what is just not working. You know, we just got out of UNESCO, and you look at UNESCO and it wasn't defining America's values. You know, they had Assad on their Human Rights Committee. I mean, that in itself, you look at that and the anti-Israel bias and all of these other things, and then you're saying, all right, why are taxpayer dollars going towards that? And we couldn't justify it anymore. And so you look at those types of things. Because a deal happens, whether it's in a previous administration or not, it doesn't mean a previous administration was right or wrong. Because you have to go back and reevaluate every program and say, is it still working? And that shouldn't be seen as an offense to a previous administration. It should be seen as America moving and changing, and we have to be able to change with it in order to keep us prosperous.
I agree with the need to make sure things are working. The American taxpayer has to be assured that the tax dollars are being well spent. I would say that when you take on what's not working, always affirm what is.
Right.
And so one of the questions that I think is out there, and it's sort of the elephant in the room, is will you affirm the things that clearly have worked? So if you ask most Americans how much of the national budget goes to foreign assistance, they'll give you wild numbers, 20, 25%. We all know that depending on how you count it, it's either less than 1% or 1.5%, depending on what you count. Now, if you look at a couple of signature programs that President Bush launched and that President Obama either kept or extended, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. Everybody says worldwide, we saved millions and millions and millions of lives. If you look at global health issues like women's cancers, we've saved lives. Malaria, we've saved lives. If you look at the Millennium Challenge, where we are actually saying to countries, you have got to be governing wisely, fighting corruption, investing in your people, or you will not get a grant from the United States of America. And oh, by the way, we'll take it away if you stop doing that, as we did with Nicaragua. That's something that could be affirmed tomorrow because there's plenty of testimony about how it's worked. So I've been, a budget officer as Stanford's provost, and as Secretary of State, I paid a lot of attention to the state budget, and I made people defend those programs every year. But it's awfully important when you're saying we're going to stop doing some things, and UNESCO, you won't get an argument from me, but you have to affirm the things that have worked too, because when you lead with what doesn't work, that's all people hear at home and abroad. And so I would just hope that it could be recalibrated to talk about all the things that work. And if I could just mention one other thing, when we talk about democracy promotion, I prefer the word democracy support because people think that when we say democracy support or democracy promotion, we mean Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, I would never have gone to the President of the United States and said, Mr. President, we ought to use American military power to bring democracy to Iraq. That wasn't the idea. We had a security issue, perhaps with not as good intelligence as we would like. Maybe it wasn't the security issue that we thought it was. We certainly had a security issue in Afghanistan where those safe havens were being used to attack the United States, and after 9/11, we had to get rid of them. So we had security issues. Once we had overthrown those dictatorships, we then had to say, what are we going to leave behind? And we believed that we were better to try to help the Iraqis and the Afghans build stable democracies. And by the way, I would still rather be the Iraqi than Syrian today. Now, most of democracy support and promotion, though, isn't that complicated. It is helping women's groups to find their voice in Kuwait. It is helping people to do election support and monitoring, which NDI and IRI, the Republican side of it, do in places that are having elections and want to make sure that they're free and fair. It's supporting a free press. It's supporting civil society. I met a woman in Russia a few years ago when we were there, a woman who was of limited sight. And she recognized that the Soviet Union and Russia had a long history of just tossing disabled people on the streets because they didn't somehow exemplify the greatness of the country. She actually went to Vladimir Putin and said, we've got to be better than that. And USAID supported her little non-governmental organization doing support for disabled people in Russia. That's what we do. And I hope that as we think about what doesn't work, we really look at what does.
And, you know, I think that it's a perfect example if you look back at the Africa policy during the Bush administration. I'm going to Africa on Saturday, the president's sending me, because we want to build it back up to what it was. It has fallen, and our African friends feel that. And so we look at PEPFAR, and we look at all of those programs where we went and helped them build up their economies and all those things. We want to get that back to where it is. But I think that, you know, there really needs to be a clarification on the budget situation with what happened. I was a governor, and when you have an executive budget, you lay out ideas, and you lay out the direction you want to go. You don't expect it to be set in stone. So when the president laid out this budget, it was just his conversation point. He was starting a conversation, and the conversation he wanted to start was, we need to build up our military. We need to update our nuclear programs. We need to make sure that we are prepared to take on any threat that America comes. The fact that the State Department was brought down to a bottom level was not the fact, oh, gut the State Department in the process. It was, this is my priority. And whatever you do, make sure that this is my priority. So when I testified before Congress, what we told them was, look, when it comes to peacekeeping issues, these are very important. We're doing these, but we're also looking at the peacekeeping issues. The budget, we had been spending 28% in funding the UN, but what we saw was every challenge that came up, they were throwing more peacekeepers at it. But they were never checking to see if they were trained. They didn't make sure they had the equipment. If we're going to do something, do it smart. Do it right. And so we've cut off $700 million of the peacekeeping budget at the UN, but we didn't cut helping people. We made them smarter. We made them better. We made the quality of those programs good. And so the same with every program at the State Department. What I'm trying to do is bridge between the president and Congress on, okay, what is really working that we don't want to gut, and what is frivolous that we do want to cut. And I think that Condi's right. We need to make sure we're always talking about what works and what's really good. And I think a perfect example was, if you saw the United Nations and you saw a high-level week, you saw a massive U.S. representation. You saw the president and the vice president and the first lady. You saw General McMaster. You saw General Kelly. You saw so many of the U.S. delegation going because they see value now in the United Nations. They see what it can do. They see the meetings that can happen and the negotiations that can happen. So I think this is a learning process for the administration as much as it's a learning process for the public, but I think we need to give each other the benefit of the doubt as we go forward.
Nikki, I think you're going to see the following problem. If funding for the United Nations is cut and you go and try to work on reform, you are not going to be listened to because you don't have the leverage. It happened to me because Congress unilaterally cut the amount of money that was going to go to the UN. It led our best friends, the British, in the General Assembly to deliver a line they had waited more than 200 years to say, representation without taxation. And so it's very hard to have any leverage. So that's part of it. The other part, I do believe that we need a strong military, but the difference between the budget for the Pentagon, over $600 billion, close, and for the State Department, under $50 billion at the moment, is crazy. We do not have a lot of tools, and it is necessary to have a functioning diplomatic service and to have people, if you're going to, talking about North Korea, to have people that are really out there. And President Trump is going on a very complicated trip at the moment. And there are not enough people in the diplomatic system to be supportive. So I'm worried about that. And I have to say this, I agree with you. I don't like democracy promotion. I think you can't impose democracy. That's an oxymoron. What you have to do is have a support system, and what I'm very proud of that NDI does is elections, but also support for the rule of law, civil society, getting women into office over the world. And by the way, the National Democratic Institute and the Republican Institute was created by Ronald Reagan. And so the issue is, and nation building is not a four-letter word. I think the bottom line is, it is in the really the advantage of the country that we're doing it, but it's better for America because we will, as you said, Connie, democracies don't fight each other. And I'm very proud of something we did, which was to create the community of democracies, which was to meet and share best practices and try to figure out how to support each other. So those are the kinds of tools that are out there that are not, I know it's new, I know what it's like to take over, but I think that there are things out there that the Trump administration could really use to strengthen America by strengthening our friends and allies.
And I think Congress has been helpful because I think what they've tried to do is really see the fact that that conversation was happening and say, okay, how can we do this? So on the peacekeeping, what you're going to see is it was at 28%. U.S. law says it's supposed to be at 25. So I've asked them to move it to 25, but it's still going to be at 25, and that's fair. We need to make sure that we keep things fair and in a good place. So we're not going to see things gutted. We're not. I mean, that's just the reality of it because we can't, and the president doesn't want to. But what we do want to say is, can we have a conversation on everything we're doing from a foreign policy standpoint internationally and make sure it is still in the best interest of the United States? And I think that's what you're seeing us try to do.
In the few minutes that we have left, I want to turn to one of the very important audiences for this conversation and this entire event, and that is the American people. We've often been described as reluctant internationalists, and I'd like to talk a bit about how do we make the case to the American people today for strong, active U.S. leadership in the world. What are the arguments? What are the proof points that need to be different? And maybe we'll use one example about free trade. Ambassador Haley, I'll start with you. As governor of South Carolina, you were a champion of global economic engagement. Some data indicate that a quarter of the state's workforce is now supported by global enterprise. How do we communicate to the American people that active trade and strong engagement has positive benefits for the country as a whole, but as individuals and as families? And what can we do better to support those who are adversely affected by globalization, by changes in technology? We'll start with you, but I'd like to ask that of the entire
I think you asked the
panel.
people of South Carolina because they're overjoyed. We now have 5 international tire companies. We have 3 international auto companies. And what you see is when we manufacture, when we get companies to come into the country and manufacture, everyone wins. Our economies get better. We have more people going to work. We see everything start to improve. And so as I recruited companies in, South Carolinians just felt the strength of what was happening. And I think Americans know that. I think what they want to see is, yes, we want to see more businesses do business in our country, but they just don't want to see us as being taken for granted. And I think in a lot of cases like South Carolina, you can talk to them and they'll tell you it's absolutely worth it. And the way I saw it as governor was either we can create the jobs in South Carolina or those jobs are going overseas, and I'd much rather have them in South Carolina than not. And that was the goal of recruiting international companies in and getting them to go and help us with our economy.
How do we create that in other states?
Well, first of all, I agree with you completely. And my home state, Alabama, is another state that is very dependent. Actually, the German car makers there are the most prolific in terms of employers, other than a couple of local companies. The problem is if you start to talk about renationalization, though, other people might decide to renationalize. So you can't say on the one hand, let's bring those factories back from Mexico or back from Canada to the United States because we're going to produce here, and then tell the Germans, oh, produce in Alabama. And so the free trade narrative can't be, I think, broken into pieces. We want to have foreign companies here, but we don't actually want to have plants in foreign countries. And I think that's a little bit of the confusion right now. And so trying to say to the American people, the reason the system works is that people can locate their production in various places, and we're getting our fair share of that in places like South Carolina and Alabama. But if I could make just one other point, you ask, what do we have to say to the American people? We do have to recognize, I'm a believer in globalization and free trade, but there are places that have not benefited. And most of it's automation, that is true. But it is also true that there are people who don't have the skills to keep up with a globalizing economy. It is absolutely true that there are people who look out at globalization and say that's a threat. So how do you address them? And I'll just make 3 quick points. I know you're going to have a panel on the domestic side, but I'm an educator. And that's really my profession. First of all, don't have any more third graders who can't read. That's right. And so the K-12 education issue is a national security problem. Secondly, don't have 18 and 19-year-olds who go to college, come out with debt and no marketable skills. And third, do something about 35-year-olds who have to be retrained. Because what's happening is Americans aren't so confident anymore that they can compete in this globalizing economy. We used to have supreme confidence that if the economic rules were fair, we would win our fair share. Now, I think the president is right to look at where those rules are not fair. He's right to look at some of the practices that China engages in. But when you're doing that, let's remember that if America is prepared, America can compete. And we've really benefited from a system in which we were allowed to compete.
I find very hard to talk about trade as kind of a zero-sum game here. It has to be reciprocal and fair and all that. What I am troubled by is that we are acting all the time as woe is me. America's in trouble, and everybody's taking advantage of us. And I think that is not healthy. First of all, it's not true. And second, it's not the kind of attitude that we need to have and that we gain from trade. You've been talking about that. But I have to say the following. I also am kind of your wonky internationalist, but I worked for Ed Muskie, and one of the things that he was chairman of the Shoe Caucus, and because I was his chief legislative assistant, I became the empress of the Shoe Caucus, and the only thing I knew about shoes was that I wore them. And so he sent me up to Maine to talk to people at the Dexter Shoe Company, and you get there, and these people, it's exactly, didn't have the skills, didn't want to move, but the interesting part was there was, whether it was a Walmart or something up there, they shopped there and bought cheaper goods. And the question is whether workers are only workers or are they also consumers, because they want to have that kind of exchange. And so I do think it has to be reciprocal. And I hope that comes, we can't tear down all the trade agreements. I happened to have been in Mexico about 3 months ago, and there was a change of mind in terms of what was happening on NAFTA. We have confused our partners and friends in terms of the direction that we want to go in trade. And part of the problem has to do with automation that has nothing to do with trade. And some of it does have to do, I so agree, Condi, on the educational issue. And I do think that we can't keep thinking that the United States is pathetic and that we're in trouble. We are not in trouble. We need to lead, and we can lead from a position of strength with partners, is the way I see it.
Ambassador Haley, would you like to respond?
You know, I think that, first of all, I will never say this country is pathetic, and I would never want anybody to think that. You know, I'm the daughter of parents who came here and reminded my brothers, my sister, and me every day how blessed we were to live in this country. I am the wife of a military veteran who fought in Afghanistan. So I want us to always be very proud of our country. But I do think when we have these trade agreements, there's nothing wrong with going back and looking at them. There's nothing wrong with seeing if we can make them better. So I don't see us tearing up any deals. If that was the case, we would have done it already. I do see the fact that, you know, this is an administration who said, let's go back and look and see, can we make it better? That's the overall theme I hear in this administration. They're constantly saying, can we make it better? In some cases, we can't make it better. In a lot of cases, we can. And I think that we have to look at that. I do absolutely agree with Condi in the fact that education is key. I saw it in South Carolina. So one of the companies we recruited was an international bicycle company from China. So in South Carolina, they're making the first American-made bicycles. It went to this small town of just a few hundred people that hadn't seen any sort of business in years. And they suddenly saw that. So they saw what it did. They saw the greatness of it. And those are the stories we have to tell.
And if I could just, the other reason that you have to be careful about the rhetoric as you're looking at what you're, there can be a reaction in other countries too.
Yeah.
We sometimes think we only speak to our audience and they don't hear it abroad. There are populists growing in places like Mexico that say, all right, if that's the game you're going to play, then elect me and I'll play that game tougher than you could ever play in America. And so it's having an effect of, I think, reinforcing this, I call them the four horses of the apocalypse: populism, nativism, isolationism, and protectionism. They tend to ride together. And so when we use that language, even for very good reason, that sometimes we do need to look at the agreements, we have to remember that others start to react and not necessarily in ways that will benefit us.
Well, the clock tells me that we are out of time. I'm so grateful to the three of you for your leadership and for your time. Thank you very much.
It was so nice to see. Let's get together sometime. I'd love to hear your story.
My name is Tim Ware, and I am an American. I am the son of Sharon and Charles Ware, one of 6 siblings, all of whom were raised to develop our own unique gifts and skills with the sole purpose of leaving this world better than we found it. In light of that, as a U.S. citizen, I believe that all of us have a responsibility to ensure that the practice of America equals the promise of America. For me, that has meant committing my life to equipping others with the tools and the skills that they need to live lives of purpose and destiny. For me, my practice has been working at St. Vincent Hospital in Indianapolis, Indiana, providing wraparound services to an at-risk community, a community that I happen to live in. It meant serving as guardian for 5 teenagers in my neighborhood, opening my home to them, to my friends and family, or friends and neighbors, while their families grappled with the challenges of poverty. It meant moving to Memphis, Tennessee at the age of 30 as a part of Teach for America to teach social studies at Fraser High School. And several years later, it meant founding and leading Veritas College Preparatory Charter School, a public middle school in Tennessee where 99% of our students were African American and over 80% qualified for free and reduced price lunch. The average 6th grader walked into our halls reading at a 3rd grade level and doing math at about a 3rd grade level as well. But by their 8th grade year, 91% of these scholars had passed the state's Algebra 1 exam, an exam that is usually given to 9th graders. For me, delivering on democracy's promise meant working at New Leaders, where I oversaw the preparation and the training that principals went through to make sure that the training that they received was equal to the task that they would face when they took the helm of a school in Memphis. For me, delivering on democracy's promise led me to take a role with the Tennessee Department of Education, where I oversaw a network of direct-run schools that were in turnaround status. Thomas Jefferson said that the education of all citizens is the only sure reliance for the preservation of our liberty. I contend that this demands that we stop asking whether or not it is possible for students in urban and rural communities to learn at the highest levels. The definitive answer is yes, it is possible. Through the practice of thoughtful policy, strong leadership, and innovation, we can deliver on democracy's promise that where you are born does not dictate where you can go in life. We can deliver on the promise that one day all students will be able to attain an excellent education. We can ensure that we don't leave any children behind and that every student can succeed. We, the people, can engage in this work and in doing so continue forming a more perfect union. We can ensure that the practice of America is equal to the promise of America. And we can ensure that democracy delivers. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our next panel, moderated by Holly Kuzmich.
Well, Tim is a hard act to follow. Thank you, Tim, for being here. And thank you to our panelists for being here. I'll introduce them in a moment. But when we started to think about this really broad topic at the Bush Institute, one of the things we knew as we talked to our advisory council and President and Mrs. Bush was we can't just talk about the international component of democracy and freedom. We really need to look at some of the challenges we have in our own country and how we reassert those principles domestically. And so our panel here today was all chosen not necessarily just because they're smart thinkers on this issue, but because they're all actually working on something to address this issue in our country. So with us today, we have Mel Martinez from JPMorgan Chase. We have Wes Moore from the Robin Hood Foundation, Jean Case from the Case Foundation, and Jeffrey Rosen from the National Constitution Center. Thank you all for being here today. Let me kick off the conversation with a question for the group. Let's follow up a little bit on the conversation we were just having. Let's talk a little bit about trust among Americans in our institutions of democracy domestically. How serious is this challenge right now, and what do you see in terms of the challenges we face here domestically? Senator Martinez, I'll start with you.
Well, thank you, and I'm inspired by all that's transpired already this morning, and I hope we can add to it from a domestic perspective. I believe there's great skepticism in our country, and I think we underestimate the impact and the power of what happened during the financial crisis. I think that was a moment in time when a lot of people began to doubt the promise of America, and the conversation began to be had that many people are having today, whether the next generation will be able to live the fruits of the American dream that I'm so proud to have lived as yet another immigrant on this panel. And so I think people began to doubt that promise of America. At the same time that there's a tremendous amount of distrust of institutions, be it church, be it state, be it whatever it may be. It's just a challenge to all. I think the speed of information, the ease of information, the news media, all of that adds to this feeling that I think we have, which is that maybe our institutions are failing us. And I think, frankly, what we need to do is to begin to re-energize those institutions, but also to look beyond the traditional governmental institutions and look to the private sector as well, and create the partnerships that are going to re-energize and revitalize our country.
Wes, what are you seeing?
So I think the disillusionment is real. The only thing is I think it started well before the financial crisis. I think for far too many people, this has been generational. This has been something that has existed long before the 2000s, and it's something that for many people, this is what they've grown up into. You know, I think about Baltimore, which is my hometown. And I remember after everything happened with Freddie Gray and the riots and the unrest after his death and what took place in Baltimore. And the fact that, you know, you had this 25-year-old young man who was arrested, and an hour later he was in a coma, and a week later he died. And there were 2 weeks of protests in Baltimore City, and that were peaceful protests until eventually one night when they were no longer peaceful. And I remember speaking with a friend of mine, and he really altered the way I was thinking about it, because we were talking about policing accountability and all this kind of stuff, and the institution that people had lost confidence in. And he asked me, he said, next time you go to a computer, do me a favor, go to YouTube and look up Freddie Gray's arrest again. And I told him, I was like, I've seen that video 100 times, I don't need to see it again because it's all over the internet. And he said, Wes, do me a favor, next time you get in front of a computer, go to YouTube and YouTube his arrest again. Except next time you YouTube Freddie Gray's arrest, don't look at Freddie. And he said, don't look at the police officers. Look at everything else. Look at the neighborhood that video was shot in. Look at the homes in the background. Look at the fact that that video was taken at 9:17 in the morning. And how many people are just standing around. They're not on the way to work. They're not on the way to school. They're standing there with cell phones taking pictures. And so the point that he was trying to make to me was, Wes, if we aren't willing to examine and do something about the macro, then you have no right to mourn the micro. I think this feeling of disillusionment that so many people feel, it's fair. It's justified. And so I think as we're talking about rebuilding institutions, it's about not just building and rebuilding basic infrastructure of institutions. There also has to be a rebuilding of a level of trust that people have to feel those institutions are there to serve them. Because I think that really began the unraveling. And I think that is the only thing that's going to really give the foundation for rebuilding any form of certitude.
Mm-hmm. Jean?
So those are powerful words, Wes, and it's kind of hard to follow that. But I will say, you know, I think this morning's words that we heard from Grace and from Tim remind us that every democracy, and it's as true in the United States as it is anywhere else, you know, can claim as its most powerful assets its citizens. So we at the Case Foundation for the last 9 years have been running a poll around perceptions and attitudes towards cause engagement and sort of the perceptions of millennials around where they think this country is going. And this year, 29% of millennials said they think the country is headed in the right direction. 29%. And you could get really discouraged by that. But then I really want to thank Secretary Albright for her words, because I think what we also see is the same millennial generation that is not sure we're heading in the right direction is filled with idealism, and they're taking that idealism into action in many ways. And I think there's a terrific opportunity to unleash and ignite civic engagement, civic action in all kinds of ways, turning them from thinking about the problems to becoming part of the solution. And I hope on the panel we'll talk about some of those things we're seeing that are exciting and uplifting in communities like Baltimore, but communities all over the United States, where citizens are jumping in and they're really owning some of these problems that they see in our communities.
Great. Jeff?
There is a direct connection between lack of education and lack of faith in institutions. That's why Tim is exactly right to quote Thomas Jefferson, democracy cannot survive ignorant and free. And that is why Mrs. Bush is exactly right that lack of civic education and knowledge about the Constitution leads to declining trust in institutions. Those Annenberg figures Mrs. Bush quoted, 1/4 of Americans cannot name a single branch of government. is directly correlated to lack of faith in institutions. People who don't know about the Constitution are more likely to favor attacks on judicial independence and not to support the rule of law. And the framers anticipated this. Madison studied direct democracies in Athens and Rome that he felt led to demagogues and the mob, and thought that only a representative republic where educated citizens choose enlightened representatives can protect liberty. That's why civic education of the kind the Bush Institute and the National Constitution Center are supporting is an urgent matter of the survival of the future of democracy. We need to teach children, as Mrs. Bush said, about the foundations of the Constitution, about the historical stories, and about the Bill of Rights. The way we're doing it at the National Constitution Center is to bring together the leading liberal and conservative scholars and thinkers and voices in America to explore every aspect of the Constitution, describing areas of agreement and disagreement. And we have this wonderful new platform called the Interactive Constitution that's gotten 15 million hits since it launched a year ago. I want you all to download it. Not now because I'm talking, but after the show, you have to go to the App Store and see this incredible app. It's co-sponsored by the leading liberal and conservative lawyers organizations in America, the Federalist Society and the American Constitution Society, who've nominated scholars to write about every single clause of the Constitution, describing areas of agreement and disagreement. It is a thrilling exercise in civic education. We need, working with the Bush Institute, creating the kind of lessons plans that Mrs. Bush is talking about and that we are creating, to create videos, learning modules, have them aligned with the standards that schools are using, and bring them to every kid in America from 8 to 80. This is not a luxury. This is not a matter of something that is at the periphery. The future of democracy depends on civic education.
So let's talk a little bit about these issues that came up about education and economic empowerment, and the fact that, number one, our education system isn't necessarily doing its job, and number two, before the recession, but even more so since, we're feeling people who just don't feel like they can be part of the American dream. So let's talk a little bit about the education piece first, and I want to hear from you all where you see some pockets of hope and where you're making your investments and how you're slowly changing that tide.
I'm happy to start, and it might be a bit controversial. Of course I believe in education, and of course I agree that an educated society will be a stronger democratic society. At the same time, I think there is tremendous potential before we get to that place where we've kind of checked the box on education is in a good spot. Why do I say that? Over a decade ago, as we saw new digital tools coming along, we were really concerned about a further divide in our nation. And we were looking at communities who were expressing some of the things we talked about in the last question, some of the concerns in their communities, et cetera. And we said, well, what if we could really ask citizens to own the problems in their communities? We developed a program called Make It Your Own, and we invited citizens across the nation to think about the challenges in their local communities and send them to us, and we had a grant program that was available, but it was a competitive grant program. But the key was, it wasn't one of these fill out this complicated academic grant application. We said, you can sing it, you can rap it, we don't care about your grammar, just give us your best thinking. And the fact of the matter is, many of the people that won the day really prove, that brilliance is equally divided, opportunity is not. Because it was amazing what we saw from people who, in some cases, didn't even have a high school degree. When you challenge citizens and you invite them in to be part of the solution, it's quite amazing what citizens at any education level, really with any background, can bring with their unique perspective about, I have an idea, and sometimes those are some of the best ideas we can find out there. So I think these connection points are really important.
Wes, you do a lot to invest in education. Talk a little bit about what you're seeing.
Thank you. So one thing that we have seen, and first, I'd be remiss if I didn't say how good it was to see my first boss when I came back from Afghanistan, Secretary Rice, and also President Bush. Thank you, and it was an honor to serve under you in multiple different facets. But what was interesting was that at Robin Hood, we have, Robin Hood was really one of the first organizations that came in early and funded charter schools. And so when you look at the growth of things like KIPP and Uncommon Success Academies, Harlem Success, et cetera, how Robin Hood came in early to support charter schools and alternative educational facets. But the interesting thing about it is this: it's not about the charter schools in particular, right? It's about the idea of, are we willing to really test and innovate mechanisms that really challenge common conceptions about education, and oftentimes common conceptions that were built and done hundreds of years ago, 100 years ago, right? And so, for example, being able to look at, not just the use of technology, but also how exactly can we raise expectations for all students so that you have students who, when they're finishing school, they're actually finishing something that allows them to move on into either college or careers. How exactly are we thinking about, in the military, we talk about this idea of border regions and the danger of border regions, because the challenge of border regions is that no one then can take accountability for an area, right? If it's a border of two countries, then one country said it's this country's fault, the other country said it's that country's fault. We have a similar type of thing in the educational system, where these border areas, these transitions between middle school and high school, elementary school and middle school, high school and college, what then often happens is you have one side who will just blame the other for the product without ever really trying to take accountability for the product. So how exactly do we think about education, not so much in a compartmentalized, siloed facet, but really in a holistic, lifelong learning mechanism, where there are smooth transitions and we are actually preparing students for these type of transitions instead of just looking at it as if, well, they move on from our area and that should be enough. And then how exactly are we thinking about the combination and the collaboration and the conversation between the workforce and the education side? Mm-hmm. Because one thing that we're seeing is the workforce needs are changing rapidly. The things that our employers now need are completely different than our employers needed 10 and 15 years ago, which is completely different than employers needed 30 years ago. Do we now have an educational system that can both keep up with that and then also prepare students for that? Because when Secretary Rice was talking about the retraining of people when they're 35, and we're talking about things like trade agreements, I would argue that, do we need to have a conversation about trade agreements? Yes, and that's fine. But the bigger conversation needs to happen, what about the 10 years before the trade agreements are signed? And are we preparing our workforce for what's going to happen as the workforce continues to change? And so when we're talking about this idea of disillusionment, a huge part of addressing the disillusionment is, do people feel that the training that they're getting and the education that they're getting is actually going to prepare them for the next 50 and 60 years of their life? And that's where being able to be critical and think critically about our educational processes does matter in that.
Mm-hmm. So let me pull a thread from the prior panel. Dr. Rice spoke about the issue of the millennial challenge, which essentially is predicated foreign aid upon good governance, where we were investing our aid. As a former HUD secretary for President Bush, I remember the disillusionment and the disappointment of the investment that the federal government had made in Detroit. The governance was not working. We dealt with tremendously poor governance, and therefore the federal investment was not bearing fruit. Fast forward some years, and now there's a Detroit example that's quite different. Good governance. Elected a terrific mayor who was willing and prepared to work with a very competent and good governor of different parties, one another, but both working together to bring Detroit back. So what did that do? That invited the private sector. The largest bank in the Detroit area, and historically, is Chase, part of JPMorgan Chase. And so our firm, under the leadership of Jamie Dimon and with a lot of good thinking, decided that we were going to make an investment in Detroit. So the investment, because there was good governance and they were making progress to lay the groundwork for success, was of $150 million. Now, that's a substantial amount of money for the private sector, but it was in partnership with local players. And so what the process was to try to build economic development so that then there can be the conditions, Wes, where education can flourish, so that there can be, in community development, job training so that they can be prepared for the jobs of tomorrow, so that there can be CDFIs, community development financial institutions, that could lend money to local entities that were not bankable by the traditional banking system. So there was a chicken and egg problem. You couldn't get them started with a little corner business so they could revitalize an area that was dilapidated and abandoned because they weren't bankable. So if you go through the CDFIs, and we finance the CDFIs, so they could then in turn provide the financing for these community businesses that were beginning to flourish, you create a cycle. So you're providing a potential for a job, you're dealing with the educational component through retraining and workforce training, essentially training for the skills of tomorrow to fill the gap in jobs that are available, but for which a lot of the workforce is just simply not trained. And in doing all of that, begin to recreate a narrative where people wanted to come back into the dilapidated and abandoned areas of Detroit and begin that cycle. It has been successful enough that now we're looking to other communities, Chicago and other places, Baltimore probably be involved as well, to where we can make that kind of investment, but in partnership with the non-for-profit, the governmental institutions, and the private sector, all working together. To me, from my long ago experience as a local mayor and everything else, that is the key to making it all come together. You've got to get all these institutions pulling together, working together, and creating the kind of conditions that can then allow a child to go to school and to flourish. By the way, needless to say, and a given in all of this, is safety. Without public safety, without lights on the corner, and without a sense of security, none of the other can work.
And Secretary Martinez brings up also a really important point about the role that partnership plays in it, and that the role that foundations and organizations can also play in this. Because, I think about the role of Robin Hood just as one example, and I see one of our board members, Alex and Bob, here as well, where the budget for the Department of Education in New York City alone is $25 billion. Wow. Okay? For the New York City Department of Education alone. Let's say Robin Hood were to put $50 million into education. That's a real number, right? And it's 0.2% in comparison to what the Department of Education budget is. The point is that there are innovations that we can support. There is risk capital that foundations and philanthropies can play to essentially de-risk investments, to essentially present things that you can say, this thing is working. We've tried it out, we funded it, we supported it, it is working, and now it's something that's ready to present to the people who can ultimately take things to scale, which is the government, which are city leaders, state leaders, federal leaders. And so there's an interesting marriage that then does take place with all these different partners, where part of the role is for each partner to understand what is your role in this. And part of it is to help to de-risk things that you can then eventually present them to a long-term effective scale.
Partnerships are crucial, and content is crucial, and you talk about risks. And we've found that the biggest risk in civic education is how to teach civics in a polarized age. Every civic question in this country, from the First Amendment to the meaning of equality, has now become politicized and polarized. The way we found it works at the National Constitution Center is to encourage citizens to separate their political views from their constitutional views. I'm a law professor. I teach law at GW Law School. And whenever I begin constitutional law class, I say, we're not going to talk about politics. We all disagree about whether gun control is a good idea. We're going to ask, does the Second Amendment allow it or prohibit it? And by insisting that you separate your politics from your constitutional views, you might reach different conclusions. You might think gun control is a good idea, but the Second Amendment prohibits it, or it's a bad idea, but the Second Amendment allows it. And that's the way to teach questions like hate speech. Mrs. Bush cited those Brookings stats. Only 39% of students understand that the Supreme Court has held the First Amendment protects hate speech. The way that you teach students that is to begin with the text of the First Amendment, to tell the story of why Thomas Jefferson believed that the First Amendment was a natural right that came from God or nature and not from government, to tell the historical stories about the fight over the Alien and Sedition Act of 1798 and Jefferson's insistence that it was unconstitutional, to teach about Supreme Court decisions like Justice Brandeis's holding that speech can only be banned in America if it's intended to and likely to cause imminent violence. The most speech-protective standard in the world, the most inspiring constitutional beacon that we have. You can't understand these principles unless you understand text, history, case law, and then, the final challenge, to make it accessible. That interactive constitution I talked to you about is a marvel. It's being used by Supreme Court justices and law clerks, but it's very wonky, and we need to make it accessible to elementary school kids, middle school kids, and high school kids, lexically accessible, using videos and pushing it out there. But the bottom line is that if you have a product that all sides can converge around, that's completely nonpartisan and multi-partisan, there's a hunger in this country to be elevated above these partisan battles and to converge around the one thing that really does unite us, the U.S. Constitution.
Jean, can you talk a little bit about what you view as the role of the philanthropic community in this? We talked a little bit about partnerships, and we'll go back to this a little bit.
Sure. And I do want to say on the Detroit model, we're watching it very carefully because it is one of the first models we've seen that is so cross-sector as was suggested. There are a couple of other elements at play, and I must say the citizen engagement in devising sort of the strategic plan for their own city ultimately is what's going to make the difference here. And then the parties came around really to enable that. Philanthropy is playing a huge role in Detroit, and as you could see, created a magnet then for others. But I think philanthropy has a very critical role in calling citizens to action and enabling pathways for them to do that. I'll give you an example. At the Case Foundation, we work in cross-sector ways. I had the true privilege of working in the Bush administration around citizen engagement and volunteer service. But in the Obama administration, we worked on something called contests and grand challenges. And the idea was the federal agencies were really facing some significant challenges, and they were kind of stymied on some of these. So what a radical concept. What if we could conclude that maybe the smartest people in the world aren't always in the hallways of federal agencies? Could we tap the brilliance of citizens out there everywhere? So we pulled together 35 federal agencies, and we brought in the X Prize and all kinds of experts to train on contests and grand challenges with the idea that we would take the challenges that the agencies had, which in effect they were trying to serve citizens through their practices, and throw them out there to citizens to solve. One of the most brilliant things happened as Ebola was threatening the nation and we were trying to figure out a solution for Ebola. It became clear that the Ebola suit itself that the relief workers and the doctors were using was a real challenge, and we needed a new Ebola suit. So a contest, a grand challenge, was used for designs. There were teams all over. The team in Baltimore, I don't know if you know this story, Wes, the team in Baltimore had a wedding dress designer on the team. And it turns out, because what? What does she do every day? She actually designs things people wear. She ended up having some of the most important sort of ads and designs that ended up in the final suit that today is changing lives. And everyone who worked on that project will tell you, including the former director of USAID, that without her sort of real citizen-based, real world, right, out there on the front lines, without her contribution to that, we wouldn't have ended up with the Ebola suit that really is standard practice today and is really caring for so many patients as a result.
Senator Martinez, can I ask you to expand a little bit about the role of business? Are they doing enough? What more can they do?
No, I think much more can be done and should be done. I mean, that's not to denigrate the efforts of so many in business today, but I think that the role of corporate foundations and of business writ large can be so significant. And you know, whether it is technology helping education or whether it is in a more cohesive way talking about economic development. I frankly got to tell you, that's an issue that is part of our domestic problem today that we have not really thought about, but the issue of Puerto Rico. It's going to take more than government to rebuild Puerto Rico. This is a huge problem that I don't think we quite have gotten it to the national consciousness yet of how big it is. But the bigness of it, the ramifications it has for communities like in Florida, where migration is going to be, migration by U.S. citizens, by the way, is going to be tremendous. It's going to take a big role for government to tackle something as big as that, but the government must entice and partner and bring in private sector in order to tackle that problem. So when you're looking at the magnitude of that issue, and that could be a laboratory, it is the same in a Baltimore, it is the same in a Detroit, Chicago, so many cities that are hurting. And the role of the private sector and corporate cannot be underestimated. I think that what we're doing is important, is terrific. I hope it's a leadership way of doing it in a way that it will entice others and invite others to participate in similar ways. Because we are a bank, we're very connected to what makes a community work. And obviously, it is in the best interest of any business, to a bank, to any other kind of business, to see a community where they work, where they invest, function, to be successful. An unsuccessful community, a community that is abandoned like Detroit, is not good for anyone. And, you know, there have been other corporate partners in Detroit, Quicken and some other entities who have come into the community and invested heavily. And so Detroit is just an example, but I think what a terrific story it can be if a city that was once the symbol of American greatness in manufacturing and in automobiles then became an abandoned city, really, with a huge reduction in population and everything else, could be reignited now as a laboratory for what can work in the future. And so I do think there's a tremendous role for the private sector. And as I say, I think it's going to also be very much needed in a big mammoth job like the reconstruction of Puerto Rico is going to be.
Jeffrey, let me turn the topic a little bit. Let's talk about social media and citizen engagement. You've talked a lot about what's good and bad about how people are using social media to connect with institutions of democracy. Say a little bit more about that.
Well, obviously, I'm a big supporter of social media as a platform for education. And the fact that you can launch an interactive constitution and within a year it gets 15 million hits is this astonishing opportunity to reach learners of all ages. Tweeting out educational videos is now reaching 14 million kids in the classroom, and the possibility for empowering individual learners to cultivate their faculties of reason is inspiring. On the other hand, it's really important to note the dangers of social media. Madison in Federalist 10 says that the worst thing that can happen in America is for representatives to communicate directly with their constituents. So I think I can say in a nonpartisan way that the idea of tweeting representatives would not have pleased James Madison. And the entire Madisonian system also is designed to slow down the processes of deliberation. Justice Brandeis, in his beautiful opinion in the Whitney case, says, as long as there's time enough for deliberation, the best response to evil counsels is good ones. That's why the whole constitutional system is set up to slow down deliberation. The idea of Brexit would be inconceivable in America because we don't make fundamental constitutional decisions by referendum or initiative or snap judgments. So to the degree that the speed of deliberation is so fast, that's polarizing people into armed camps, into filter bubbles and echo chambers. We've learned about how people are just consuming their news from like-minded news sources and not hearing arguments on the other side is a profound democratic challenge. But the social media and the platforms are both the challenge and the solution. The same social media that can polarize people can also bring together the Federalist Society and the American Constitution Society. Ladies and gentlemen, these groups were like the Montagues and the Capulets. They had not worked together before the Constitution Center brought them together, but they were inspired to be asked in a civil way to explore areas of agreement and disagreement. And I've become increasingly convinced that this education project is itself the Madisonian model. When people are required respectfully to listen to opposite points of view and to consider what they agree with and disagree with about, that itself is an exercise of citizenship of the highest kind. So we need to use social media to spread the light and to empower people to educate, to cultivate their faculties of reason, but at the same time mitigate the effects that may challenge reason rather than promote it.
We are seeing civic action today with digital tools. You know, the Case Foundation has invested about $4 million in 3 giving platforms over the last 10 years. And today, over $5 billion of giving through micro donations, $10 and $20 by citizens, many of them giving for the first time, young people using these digital tools. It's getting them engaged in causes. It's bringing them to action and things that they care about. So sometimes I think we look at the divide and we're not as careful to look at the true upside that we see that's bringing people out and into action and caring. If I can, I want to go back to your business point for just a minute. I think it's really important when we think about business in America to recognize something that I think a lot of people don't understand. The Kauffman Foundation did a study and came out and said, all net new jobs in America are not created by big companies. They're not created by small businesses. They're actually created by startups, new firms. And we should be concerned and vigilant in the nation, because last year, 78% of all venture capital, the jet fuel that helps young firms grow, went to just 3 places: Massachusetts, New York, and California. 90% went to men, leaving just 10% for female founders, and less than 1% went to African American founders. So if we're going to see shared prosperity in our communities, if we care about job growth, if we care about economic viability, we really have to pay attention to that area of business that we don't often think of, which is making sure we are enabling and training up our next generation of entrepreneurs, which really, when we think about the American dream, it really is a promise that if you have a good idea, this is the place you can come and make it real.
I want to make a comment also. We haven't talked about the role of local and state government in being a laboratory for what works in America. You know, through the years of the Great Society, whatever, the growth in the federal government, which was not historically the way America grew. And Jeff, if I'd had you for constitutional law in law school, I would have gotten a much better grade, because you really get it, make it very exciting.
It is exciting.
I like it. But anyway, we forget that for most of our history, right, Jeff, our country was really governed by local and state governments, not by the federal government, particularly in domestic issues. And so we need to go back to that and rethink the role of the federal government, being supportive and being a source of funding and whatnot. Terrific. Good ideas. What makes community works is what's really closest to the people. And I would dare say working with community organizations like foundations, like businesses, like the people in business who volunteer, and the volunteer community, the not-for-profit community, working with the local government, their local representatives that they see at the grocery store, that they talk to every day. I mean, it's a little different to be in Washington and removed from the day-to-day of people's lives and living with them in their locality. Ambassador Haley had the experience of being a governor, of knowing what goes on at that granular level of governance. And so I really think as we try to think of what is going to make us believe in our country again and believe that it works again, the role of local government must be highlighted and understood.
And you know, it's interesting, and there is a power of the role of local government, because, you know, it's been said that the people who are closest to the problem are generally the ones closest to the solution.
Absolutely.
Right. You know, and, you know, I think about it, you know, from my time in the military, you know, your time as a platoon leader is your best experience, because you know everything about every member of your platoon. And the higher up you move in the ranks, the further you are removed. And so the further you're removed from actually being able to understand the everyday things that are going on in your individual soldier's life. And so that's one of the powerful things about local and state governments also, is they're also the ones who are closest to hear about what's going on and to be able to then grow out the ideas that are working. You know, I think Gene brought up a great point about, you know, and this role of technology and the role of these entrepreneurs. I mean, I think about things that we're supporting right now, one thing called Fresh EBT, which is, you know, this is a guy who founded Facebook groups. And then he obviously did pretty well because he founded Facebook groups. And then he said, I now want to spend my time focusing on poverty issues. And he's created something called Fresh EBT, which is a technology which helps people manage their benefits. And so whether you're on WIC, food stamps, you know, regardless of which benefits you then qualify for, SNAP, it helps you to better financially manage the benefits, and also helps you to eat better. And there's tracking mechanisms that you can put inside the app. There's another great entrepreneur that created something called Good Call, where everyone knows, kind of like the witching hour, you know, when you're arrested, the first 2 hours are the most important hours after you are arrested. And who your first phone call to, there has a chance of actually increasing the chance of your conviction by 75% if your first phone call is not to either an attorney or to a family member who can then get you proper representation, right? And he's created a technology which is a basic algorithm that connects to switchboards, so that the first call that you make will be to both, first it will notify your family where you are, and then it also notifies a public defender that is now going to then serve as your legal representation. He has managed to cut the conviction rate for the people significantly, and now it's in the Bronx. Now they're talking about incorporating it citywide. These are local people, local people who have their ear to the ground about what's going on, found a need, are creating something interesting, and now local governments are saying, well, why shouldn't we be doing this? And it's just a smart way of thinking about scaling bright ideas that can then have a long-term impact on populations and communities that we serve.
So, Wes, let me follow up with a question for you. We've talked a little bit today about disillusionment that we've seen. We've partly seen it in the Rust Belt and Middle America, but I know you're doing some work on the African American community specifically. And what are you finding is the disillusionment there, and how does it match other populations?
Well, I think the disillusionment is, and the challenge of the disillusionment is that it's compounded, right? That it's not so much even a disillusionment that we're seeing amongst an institution. It really is institutions, right? And so when you have a situation, so let's take education, for example, and I'll just tell you just a simple reference from Baltimore. 5,000 kids will graduate from high school every year in Baltimore. 500 of them are prepared for college or careers when they walk across the graduation stage. 10%. So the 90% of kids, and these are the ones that graduate, even for the ones that move on to higher education, they're then having to take developmental coursework when they move on to college. The challenge of developmental coursework when you move on to higher education is this, is that it costs exactly the same, except you're getting no credit for it. So you have students who will then take whole batteries of developmental coursework, pay the same amount, and at the end of the year, after using all their freshman tuition and using aid or whatever it is to get them freshman tuition, will then have 6 or 3 or no credits to their name. Chances are that student will never graduate from college because if nothing else, their financial aid will run out, right? And so you've watched how disillusionment then plays itself out on so many different fronts. I think that the key thing and the key way that we have to address it is we have to be incredibly deliberate about the expectations that we're setting. And honestly, I think President Bush said it best when he talked about this idea, this soft bigotry of low expectations, where we just have different expectations for different kids who come up in different communities. I remember once, I wrote this story called The Other Westmore, talking to myself and another young man from Baltimore, who he's currently, with the same name from the same area, similar family backgrounds, he's currently in year 16 of his life sentence in prison. For, at the same time I had received a Rhodes Scholarship, he was convicted for the murder of a police officer. And so the story kind of detailed the lives of these two kids and what ends up happening that causes this split with the same names. And I remember once speaking with him, and I asked him, we were talking about Baltimore, and I said, so do you think that we're products of our environments? And he looked back at me and he said, actually, I think we're products of our expectations. And I thought to myself, he is absolutely right. We were not products of our environments. We were products of our expectations. And someone once said to me, it's a real shame that you lived up to your expectations and he didn't. And I told him, actually, the real shame is that we both did. We both lived up to our expectations. And so when we're talking about things like creating hope and opportunity, the very first thing we have got to do is this soft bigotry of low expectations that we have for so many kids and so many communities, for things that they were born into, and for things they should not be ashamed of. We have to be able to psychologically change the bars and the barriers. Booker T. Washington once said, and he said it best, and I'll paraphrase when he said, if you break a man's spirit, you do not have to escort him to the back door, because he will walk there himself. And we have far too many people who are walking there by themselves.
Thank you.
I think Wes brings up a great point. So I'm a child of a single mom who raised 4 kids alone. And there's just no way I'd be sitting on this stage or have accomplished anything I have in my life without mentors who came alongside and lifted me up. And I know when President Bush was in office, he used his leadership platform to call on citizens to come alongside of citizens and offer a helping hand or even just, a shoulder to lean against. And I think, when we look, and by the way, it's not just people who are raised in challenging circumstances that need this. All young people need this. People at different points in their careers need this. So the whole idea of mentoring as a powerful way to bring citizens forward and let them be the best that they can be, is something that I think really needs to be recognized and honestly has fallen off a little bit in terms of leaders calling for it in the nation. But I think it plays a really key role. And I bet if we went around the room and asked people, how'd you get here today? Even people who came out of privileged circumstances will be able to point to somebody who took them and said, let me help you get ahead. And I just think that the power of that is often not recognized.
So we've got just a few minutes left. I want to try and end on a more hopeful note. Well,
that was pretty hopeful.
That was.
We're all hopeful.
As a group, we're going to end on a hopeful note and tee up our next speaker. So what's the kind of opportunity that this challenge brings, and how do we step up to the plate? Jeffrey, I'll start with you.
How could you not be optimistic in hearing about that extraordinary testament to the power of expectations and inspiring students to cultivate their faculties of reason to achieve their best potentials can often be done by telling the story of America. Yeah. There's nothing more inspiring than this glorious story and learning about the constitutional story. So this year is the 150th anniversary of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. That's the amendment that guarantees all persons equal protection of the law and denies any state the power to deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process. That was the fulfillment of Jefferson's promise in the Declaration, which was revived by Lincoln with the new birth of freedom at Gettysburg. And it took the Civil War, the bloodiest war in American history, to enshrine it in the Constitution. And then, of course, it didn't become a reality until the Civil Rights Movement and Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Act. These are gloriously inspiring stories, and there is something both empowering and motivating about education in giving students the sense that they have the power to fulfill their dreams. And once you learn about this beautiful history, then you are optimistic about America, because you know how glorious these freedoms are, how they do unite us, and despite all the noise and clamor of social media and polarization and politics, there's this shining core at the center of it, which is our ideals that unite us as Americans.
Next time, I don't want to sit next to Jeff on the panel, okay?
I don't want to sit next to any of you guys, or Wes.
So look, I think it's been a common theme here on stage. I think our greatest asset really is our citizens. And I think it's for each of us to say, how can we use our resources, our influence, our networks, whatever we have to bring to call citizens to action? There isn't a problem out there that citizens banded together can't address and bring to a solution. And I just think we have to bring hope and promise and encourage citizens to get in the arena, as Teddy Roosevelt said. And that's going to be the path to get us out of this divide and into addressing opportunity for all.
Wes.
Thank you. I echo that. I mean, I am actually incredibly hopeful, and I hope it didn't come off that I'm not, because, and I think part of the reason that I'm hopeful is that we spend every day in communities with change agents who are doing remarkable things. You know, some people say they'll throw these horrific stats out, and they're like, how do you stay optimistic despite these stats? And my answer is because I don't live in stats. I live in communities. I live in communities where we're watching single moms who are working multiple jobs and just absolute heroes for their families. I live in communities where we're watching people who are waking up at the crack of dawn and who will meet people every single day with a huge smile on their face. We're living in communities where we're watching ministers and faith leaders and elected officials who every day know that they're living for something bigger than themselves. And so I don't live in stats. I live in communities. And that's why I'm just incredibly hopeful about where we can get to.
So difficult to be here this morning and hear the story of Grace Ho, and that she believes in America and still chose to come to this country. We had on the earlier panel Secretary Albright, not only an immigrant, but a person whose life story and that of her father and her family is a remarkable story, but such an American story. And in addition to that, we have on that panel a former governor and currently our representative to the United Nations, the daughter of Indian immigrants. We had on that panel an African-American woman who grew up in segregated Alabama who rose to the ranks of Secretary of State. All these incredible people we've been hearing from today, we all have a story. I'm an immigrant myself, and my story does not allow me not to believe in America. And what happened in my life, the institutions, the people, the goodness of the American people that I saw in my own life is still here today. And what we have to do is to tap it, to continue to believe in it, and to tell others the way Jeffrey does, in a way that really gets you excited and interested about what our country is. So I think it goes back to the beginning, which is when we said people don't know our institutions. They don't, what Laura spoke about, the fact that she spoke about the need for education about our institutions, about our history, about who we are. And so I'm an irrepressible optimist about America, and I'm glad that I get the last word because no one gets to rebut that.
Well, thank you all. Thank you all for carrying that message forward. And now on to our next speaker. Thank you all.
My mom and dad had told me different.
Good morning. I'm Tom Bernstein, a president and co-founder of Chelsea Piers here in New York. And as a New Yorker, I'm delighted that this forum is being held in our city, and I'm thrilled to welcome President and Mrs. Bush back to New York. I'm honored to serve as chairman of the Human Freedom Advisory Council at the George W. Bush Institute. And it's very clear being here this morning that the spirit of liberty is alive and well in this room. I'm delighted that several of our distinguished advisory council members are here with us today. Elliot Abrams, Scott Carpenter, Carl Gershman, Nancy Kane Marcus, Ken Wallach, and Craig Stapleton, who also serves on the Bush Center board. Thank you all for your service and for joining us this morning. As our advisory council considered programming for the Human Freedom Initiative, as Holly noted, we felt that it was difficult to think about how we advance American leadership in the world without considering issues here at home. And thus our program this morning recognizes that very important connection. Today's event is emblematic of the work of the Bush Center, nonpartisan, action-oriented, and unique in bringing diverse groups of people together to address the problems facing America and the world. I happen to be a lifelong Democrat, but I'm a great friend and admirer of President and Mrs. Bush, and proud to stand with them and the Bush Center team on their vital work to expand human freedom all around the world. As we all know, President and Mrs. Bush believe that freedom is truly universal and that every human being deserves to live in a society that respects their fundamental rights. We stand with dissidents and freedom advocates around the world to tell their stories and support their causes. We work to inform our leaders and the general public about why these efforts are essential. I encourage you to learn more about this important work and join us in promoting the cause of human freedom. Thank you all for being here today.
Hello. Good morning. My name is Ramon Padilla, and I am an American. So is my wife Judith, my 5 kids, my mom and dad, my brother, and my 2 sisters. I was born in Mexico and was brought to the States at the age of 2. I was raised in Los Angeles area in a small town named of El Monte, where we had a 70 to 80% Hispanic community. And a good percentage of that community were illegal immigrants. We were blessed as a family to have family members and friends that were citizens, and they sponsored our family. And at an early age, we became temporary and permanent residents. And I can thank my parents for that. As for They were hardworking and responsible community members. My parents worked hard to build a new life in this country for my brother and me. Their values, work, family, faith, service to community were taught to us at an early age. We saw those same values in our community. My Mexican-American family and community helped shape the lives of 2 boys to serve their country in the U.S. military, retire with an honorable discharge, have 4 combat tours under their belts, 2 Bronze Stars, a Purple Heart, and more importantly, become American citizens. And if that's not a gift from God to this great country of ours, I don't know what is. I joined the military because I realized what the nation had done for me and my family. Freedom in America means opportunity and sacrifice to me. I wanted to give back to America and repay what America had given to me. So I joined the military, I joined the Army. I served with pride as an infantryman and a paratrooper with tours in Korea, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And soon after I came back from Iraq, in 2006, I became an American citizen. In order for me to do that, I had to do another tour in Los Angeles. That ain't no joke either. After being medically retired due to my combat injuries I received in Afghanistan, I became a little selfish and decided to care about myself until I met 43 at the inaugural Royal Open Golf Invitation and realized how much he still cared and supported all warriors, even after his presidency. From then on, I decided to strap my boots back on and continue to fight alongside my commander-in-chief in supporting my community. I continue to serve my country as a federal employee, and I serve my community by coaching and teaching baseball to all kids, not just the talented kids, all kids, all genders, all races and cultures, in order to help them develop to become better citizens in their community. I help plant that seed. Those same values that matter to Americans, community, family, freedom, and faith, also matter to the people in North Korea, Iraq, and Afghanistan. The spirit of liberty that flows in America also needs to flow around the world. All we need to do is help them find their George Washington. As in my case, I found my George W. Bush. Thank you for your time and continued support. Ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor of introducing President George W. Bush.
Thank you all. Thank you. Okay. Padilla. Gracias. Yeah. So I painted Ramon. I wish you were still standing here. It's a face only a mother could love. No, it was a fabulous. I love you, Ramon. Thank you very much for being here. And Grace Joe, thank you for your testimony. And Big Tim. I got to know Tim as a result of Presidential Leadership Scholars, a program at the Bush Center along with the Clinton Center, and with help from 41 and LBJ's libraries. I want to. I am thrilled that friends of ours from Afghanistan, China, North Korea, and Venezuela are here as well. These are people who've experienced the absence of freedom. I mean, they know what it's like. And they know there's a better alternative than tyranny. Laura and I are thrilled that the Bush Center supporters are here. Bernie, I want to thank you and your committee. I call him Bernie. It's amazing to have Secretary Albright share the stage with Condi and Ambassador Haley. For those of you who kind of take things for granted, that's a big deal. Thank you. We are gathered in the cause of liberty. That's why we're here. This is a unique moment. The great democracies face new and serious threats, yet
seem to be losing confidence in their own calling and competence. Economic, political, and national security challenges proliferate, and they're made worse by the tendency to turn inward. The health of the democratic spirit itself is at issue, and the renewal of that spirit is the urgent task at hand. Since World War II, America has encouraged and benefited from the global advance of free markets, from the strength of democratic alliances, and from the advance of free societies. At one level, this has been a raw calculation of interest. The 20th century features some of the worst horrors of history because dictators committed them. Free nations are less likely to threaten and fight each other. And free trade helped make America into a global economic power. For more than 70 years, the presidents of both parties believed that American security and prosperity were directly tied to the success of freedom in the world. They knew that the success depended in large part on U.S. leadership. The mission came naturally because it expressed the DNA of American idealism. We know deep down that repression is not the wave of the future. We know that the desire for freedom is not confined to or owned by any culture. It is the inborn hope of our humanity. We know that free governments are the only way to ensure that the strong are just and the weak are valued. And we know that when we lose sight of our ideals, it is not democracy that has failed. It is the failure of those charged with preserving and protecting democracy. This is not to underestimate the historical obstacles to the development of democratic institutions and a democratic culture. Such problems nearly destroyed our country, and that should encourage a spirit of humility and a patience with others. Freedom is not merely a political menu option or a foreign policy fad. It should be the defining commitment of our country and the hope of the world. That appeal is proved not just by the content of people's hopes, but a noteworthy hypocrisy. No democracy pretends to be a tyranny. Most tyrannies pretend they are democracies. Democracy remains the definition of political legitimacy. That has not changed, and that will not change. Yet for years, challenges have been gathering to the principles we hold dear, and we must take them seriously. Some of these problems are external and obvious. Here in New York City, you know the threat of terrorism all too well. It's being fought even now on distant frontiers and in the hidden world of intelligence and surveillance. There is the frightening, evolving threat of nuclear proliferation and outlaw regimes. There's an aggressive challenge by Russia and China to the norms and rules of global order. They propose revisions that always seem to involve less respect for the rights of free nations and less freedom for the individual. These matters would be difficult under any circumstances. They are further complicated by a trend in Western countries away from global engagement and democratic confidence. Parts of Europe have developed an identity crisis. We have seen insolvency, economic stagnation, youth unemployment, anger about immigration, resurgent ethno-nationalism, and deep questions about the meaning and durability of the European Union. America is not immune from these trends. In recent decades, public confidence in our institutions has declined. Our governing class has often been paralyzed in the face of obvious and pressing needs. The American dream of upward mobility seems out of reach for some who feel left behind in a changing economy. Discontent deepened and sharpened partisan conflicts. Bigotry seems emboldened. Our politics seems more vulnerable to conspiracy theories and outright fabrication. There are some signs that the intensity of support for democracy itself has waned especially among the young, who never experienced the galvanizing moral clarity of the Cold War, or never focused on the ruin of entire nations by socialist central planning. Some have called this democratic deconsolidation. Really, it seems to be a combination of weariness, frayed tempers, and forgetfulness. We've seen our discourse degraded by casual cruelty. At times, it can seem like the forces pulling us apart are stronger than the forces binding us together. Argument turns too easily into animosity. Disagreement escalates into dehumanization. Too often, we judge other groups by their worst examples, while judging ourselves by our best intentions, forgetting the image of God we should see in each other. We've seen nationalism distorted into nativism. We've forgotten the dynamism that immigration has always brought to America. We see a fading confidence in the value of free markets and international trade, forgetting that conflict, instability, and poverty follow in the wake of protectionism. We've seen the return of isolationist sentiments, forgetting that American security is directly threatened by the chaos and despair of distant places, where threats such as terrorism, infectious disease, criminal gangs, and drug trafficking tend to emerge. In all these ways, we need to recall and recover our own identity. Americans have great advantage. To renew our country, we only need to remember our values. It's part of the reason we meet here today. How do we begin to encourage a new 21st century American consensus on behalf of democratic freedom and free markets? That's the question I pose to scholars at the Bush Institute. That's why Pete Wehner and Tom Maleo are with us today, have answered with the spirit of liberty at home in the world, the call to action paper. Recommendations come in broad categories. Here they are. First, America must harden its own defenses. Our country must show resolve and resilience in the face of external attacks on our democracy. And that begins with confronting a new era of cyber threats. America has experienced a sustained attempt by a hostile power to feed and exploit our country's divisions. According to our intelligence services, the Russian government has made a project of turning Americans against each other. This effort is broad, systemic, and stealthy. It's conducted across a range of social media platforms. Ultimately, this assault won't succeed. But foreign aggressions, including cyber attacks, disinformation, and financial influence, should never be downplayed or tolerated. It's a clear case where the strength of our democracy begins at home. We must secure our electoral infrastructure and protect our electoral system from subversion. The second category of recommendations concerns the projection of American leadership, maintaining America's role in sustaining and defending an international order rooted in freedom and free markets. Our security and prosperity are only found in wise, sustained global engagement, in the cultivation of new markets for American goods, in the confrontation of security challenges before they fully materialize and arrive on our shores, in the fostering of global health and development as alternatives to suffering and resentment, in the attraction of talent, energy, and enterprise from all over the world, in serving as a shining hope for refugees and a voice for dissidents, human rights defenders, and the oppressed. We should not be blind to the economic and social dislocations caused by globalization. People are hurting, they're angry, and they're frustrated. We must hear and help them, but we cannot wish globalization away, any more than we could wish away the agricultural revolution or the industrial revolution. One strength of free societies is their ability to adapt to economic and social disruptions, and that should be our goal. To prepare American workers for new opportunities, to care in practical, empowering ways for those who feel left behind. The first step should be to enact policies that encourage robust economic growth by unlocking the potential of the private sector and for unleashing the creativity and compassion of this country. Third focus of the document is strengthening democratic citizenship. And here we must put particular emphasis on the values and views of the young. Our identity as a nation, unlike many other nations, is not determined by geography or ethnicity, by soil or blood. Being an American involves the embrace of high ideals and civic responsibility. We become the heirs of Thomas Jefferson by accepting the ideal of human dignity found in the Declaration of Independence. We become the heirs of James Madison by understanding the genius and values of the U.S. Constitution. We become the heirs of Martin Luther King, Jr. by recognizing one another not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. This means that people of every race, religion, ethnicity can be fully and equally American. It means that bigotry or white supremacy in any form is blasphemy against the American creed. And it means the very identity of our nation depends on the passing of civic ideals to the next generation. We need a renewed emphasis on civic learning in schools, and our young people need positive role models. Bullying and prejudice in our public life sets a national tone, provides permission for cruelty and bigotry, and compromises the moral education of children. The only way to pass along civic values is to first live up to them. Finally, the call to action calls on major institutions of our democracy, public and private, to consciously and urgently attend to the problem of declining trust. For example, our democracy needs a media that is transparent, accurate, and fair. Our democracy needs religious institutions that demonstrate integrity and champion civil discourse. Our democracy needs institutions of higher learning that are examples of truth and free expression. In short, it is time for American institutions to step up and provide cultural and moral leadership for this nation. 10 years ago, I attended a conference on democracy and security in Prague. The goal was to put human rights and human freedom at the center of our relationships with repressive governments. The Prague Charter, signed by champions of liberty Václav Havel, Natan Sharansky, Jose Maria Aznar, called for the isolation and ostracism of regimes that suppress peaceful opponents by threats or violence. Little did we know that, a decade later, a crisis of confidence would be developing within the core democracies, making the message of freedom more inhibited and wavering. Little did we know that the repressive governments would be undertaking a major effort to encourage division in Western societies and to undermine the legitimacy of elections. Repressive rivals, along with skeptics here at home, misunderstand something important. It's the great advantage of free societies that we creatively adapt to challenges without the direction of some central authority. Self-correction is the secret strength of freedom. We are a nation with a history of resilience and a genius for renewal. Right now, one of our worst national problems is a deficit of confidence. But the cause of freedom justifies all our faith and effort. It still inspires men and women in the darkest corners of the world. It will inspire a rising generation. The American spirit does not say we shall manage or we shall make the best of it. It says we shall overcome. And that is exactly what we're going to do with God's help. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mrs. Bush. To close our program, I want to thank all of our distinguished speakers and panelists for being here today, for all of our guests in the room and watching us live. Thank you. And let me, of course, also express our appreciation to the sponsors who so generously support our work at the Bush Institute. President Bush just said it is time for institutions to step up and provide cultural and moral leadership for our country, and we intend to do that at the Bush Center. You heard Ken Hirsch talk about the work of the Bush Center at the beginning of the program, and you've seen those priorities in action today. First, we work to develop leaders in our work with North Korean refugees, presidential leadership scholars, and our work with veterans. Thank you to Grace, Tim, and Ramon for being here today. We work to advance policy. I encourage you all to read the new call to action paper that Pete Wehner and Tom Melia authored. You can find it on our website at bushcenter.org. We take action on the challenges that America and the world faces. You heard Mrs. Bush talk about our upcoming public opinion research project that we will be doing with Freedom House and the Penn Biden Center. We're pleased that Mike Abramowitz, the president of Freedom House, and Tony Blinken, the managing director of the Penn Biden Center, are with us today. And we look forward to that work, which will be coming out in 2018. And we'll also work with others collectively to expand our efforts. We're pleased to announce a new initiative we're undertaking with Jeff Rosen and the National Constitution Center to encourage greater understanding of our Constitution and our rights within it. We'll host an event in Dallas at the Bush Center next February on this important topic, and we look forward to working with Jeff on that. Finally, I also encourage you to visit bushcenter.org to read the latest issue of our online digital publication, The Catalyst. This most recent edition is all about this topic of democracy, and several of the speakers and panelists that were here today are authors. This is just the start of our work on this important issue, so stay tuned for the next stage of this work and for continuing this conversation. Thank you for being here.